For decades, Dean Martin was seen as the man who never hurt, never broke, and never stayed long enough to feel pain. He made millions laugh, drink, and forget their troubles while hiding a private life that slowly collapsed behind closed doors. Beside him stood Jeanne Martin, a woman the public barely noticed, yet one who carried the quiet weight of his choices. Their story did not end in glamour or peace. It ended in silence, distance, and a grief that arrived too late to be repaired. The marriage that looked perfect from the outside. When Dean Martin married Jean Bagger in the late 1940s, Hollywood treated the union as a perfectly timed fairy tale. Dean was no longer just a nightclub performer. His partnership with Jerry Lewis was exploding beyond expectations, pushing him into radio, film, and eventually television. He was becoming a national figure, recognizable not only for talent, but for attitude. Jeanne, meanwhile, arrived without scandal or hunger for power. She had already been admired in her own right, crowned a regional beauty figure, and praised for her composure rather than ambition. To studio publicists, she was ideal. To Dean's audience, she became proof that the man behind the jokes was anchored by a respectable home life. Jeanne's transformation was immediate. Almost overnight, she stopped being seen as an individual and became an extension of Dean Martin's image. The expectations placed on her were rigid and unspoken. She was to be supportive without demanding attention, present without interfering, elegant without threatening the spotlight. Hollywood rewarded women who made themselves useful and invisible at the same time, and Jeanne understood this quickly. She played the role flawlessly, rarely contradicting her husband publicly and never attempting to compete with his career. Inside the marriage, however, the pressures accumulated quietly. Dean's professional life revolved around late nights, constant travel, and an environment where excess was not only tolerated but encouraged. Alcohol, humor, and emotional distance became tools of survival for him. Jeanne, left to manage a growing household, absorbed the weight of responsibility without complaint. She raised children, managed schedules, and shielded the family from the chaos that followed Dean home from the stage. The imbalance between them did not begin with betrayal or scandal. It grew slowly, through missed moments and emotional absence. Dean rarely explained himself and avoided conversations that required vulnerability. Conflict made him uncomfortable, so it was easier to retreat into routine and performance. Jeanne learned that persistence mattered more than confrontation. She carried loneliness quietly, understanding that it did not look dramatic enough to be acknowledged, yet powerful enough to reshape her sense of self. By the time cracks appeared in public, the emotional damage had already taken root. Their separation did not come as a violent collapse, but as an admission that they had been living parallel lives for years. When the marriage officially ended after 2 decades, fans were stunned. The illusion of perfection dissolved overnight. Jeanne was no longer the symbol of stability, and Dean was exposed as a man whose success had come at a personal cost he could no longer hide. The end of their marriage did not close the story. It opened the door to a far darker chapter, one defined by loss, regret, and consequences neither of them would ever fully escape. After the divorce, guilt, distance, and a family slowly breaking apart. After the divorce, Dean Martin did not collapse in any way the public could recognize. There were no confessions, no visible breakdowns, no sudden disappearances from the stage. To fans, he remained familiar and intact. He continued to perform, continued to joke, and continued to project the same relaxed confidence that had defined his career for decades. That appearance of stability, however, was carefully maintained. Behind it, the family structure Jeanne had spent 20 years sustaining quietly began to dissolve. Dean had relied on Jeanne to manage the emotional and practical weight of family life. Once she was gone, there was no system in place to replace her role. He did not adapt easily to domestic responsibility, nor did he attempt to reconstruct a stable environment for his children. Instead, he leaned into routine and distance, treating separation as something to endure rather than examine. The result was not chaos, but gradual erosion. Jean's life after the divorce followed a very different path. She no longer lived within the protective boundary of Dean's fame, yet his presence remained unavoidable. Her identity in the public eye was still tied to him, even as she worked to build a life defined by independence and motherhood. She centered her world around the children, becoming their emotional constant while shielding them from conflict they were too young to understand fully. Jeanne did not sever contact with Dean. She believed distance would only deepen the damage. But communication was careful, restrained, and often tense, shaped by years of unresolved disappointment. Dean's relationship with his children became increasingly inconsistent. He expressed affection in bursts rather than patterns. Weeks or months of absence would be followed by sudden gestures of attention that felt generous but confusing. The children learned not to rely on continuity. Jean absorbed the emotional fallout, translating their disappointment into reassurance, often at her own expense. This role slowly drained her, yet she avoided public complaint, unwilling to turn private pain into spectacle. As time passed, Dean's emotional detachment became fixed. He surrounded himself with friends, familiar habits, and distractions that discouraged introspection. Alcohol and humor remained close companions, softening regret without confronting it. Jean observed this from a distance, aware that the man she once knew was withdrawing further into isolation. Their divorce had ended the marriage, but it had not resolved its consequences. What followed was not bitterness or confrontation, but silence. Dean avoided reflecting on what had been lost. Jeanne carried the memory of what had been sacrificed. Their family did not break in a single dramatic moment. It weakened gradually through emotional absence, miscommunication, and endurance. That slow unraveling set the stage for a tragedy so severe it would force them back together, not as partners, but as parents bound once again by grief. The death of Dean Paul Martin Jr. and the reunion built on grief. In 1987, tragedy entered the Martin family without ceremony or warning. Dean Paul Martin Jr., the son who carried his father's name and a quiet sense of responsibility, was killed at the age of 35 while piloting a military jet during a routine training mission. The event was sudden, clinical, and devastating in its finality. To the public, it registered as another brief headline involving a famous name. Inside the family, it shattered what little emotional stability remained. Dean Paul had chosen a life defined by discipline rather than spectacle. Unlike his father, he pursued structure, service, and physical rigor, building a career that deliberately distanced him from Hollywood's excess. For Dean Martin and Jean, this choice represented something rare, proof that a different outcome was possible. He was the living bridge between two worlds that no longer aligned. His death erased that bridge instantly. For Dean Martin, the loss dismantled his lifelong strategy of avoidance. Humor, detachment, and performance had shielded him from emotional reckoning for decades. None of it worked now. Grief arrived without escape routes. Friends noticed immediate changes. He spoke less, withdrew from social circles, and abandoned the lightness that once came effortlessly. The role he had played for so long no longer protected him. Jean was the first person he reached out to, not because of obligation, but because she understood the loss in a way no one else could. There were no attempts to revisit the past, no reopening of old wounds. Their reunion was quiet and unspoken. Shared silence replaced explanation. For the first time in nearly 20 years, resentment was irrelevant. They were no longer separated by history. They were united by shock. In grief, their relationship found a different shape. They did not return to marriage, nor did they attempt to reconstruct what had already ended. Instead, they reclaimed something more basic: mutual recognition. Jeanne offered Dean a space where memory did not accuse. She remembered him before fame hardened his emotional edges, before alcohol became routine, before humor replaced honesty. With her, he was not required to perform resilience. Dean's grief reshaped his later years. Performances continued out of habit rather than passion. Those close to him sensed a dimming presence, a man moving forward without direction. Jean remained nearby, not as a partner, but as a constant witness. She appeared during holidays, family gatherings, and moments when loss resurfaced without warning. Their connection was built not on nostalgia, but on shared endurance. Tragedy accomplished what time could not. It closed the emotional distance that had defined their post-divorce years. They were not reunited by love, but by something heavier and more permanent. Grief stripped away illusion and returned them to their most human roles. Two parents standing together again, facing a loss that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The final years, decline, regret, and the silence before goodbye. By the early 90s, Dean Martin was no longer the man audiences remembered from his peak years. His body slowed, his voice weakened, and the effortless confidence that once defined him began to fade. Years of heavy drinking had taken their toll, quietly damaging his health long before the consequences became visible. Though he attempted periods of sobriety, the long-term effects were irreversible. Dean withdrew from public life with little explanation. Concert appearances became rare, interviews almost non-existent. Those close to him described a man who lived cautiously, aware that his body could no longer sustain the lifestyle he once glorified. Behind closed doors, regret surfaced in ways it never had before. He spoke less about success and more about family, about time lost and words left unsaid. Jean remained nearby, not out of obligation, but out of history. Their connection in these years was gentle and restrained. They spoke about their children, especially Dean Paul, whose absence never stopped haunting them. There was no bitterness left between them, only quiet understanding and the shared knowledge that life had narrowed to what truly mattered. On Christmas Day, 1995, Dean Martin died from respiratory failure. He was 78. The timing felt cruelly symbolic. A man whose career thrived on celebration passed away on a day meant for warmth and family. Jean was not his wife then, but she was part of the small circle that understood the full weight of that loss. For her, it marked the final chapter of a story that had shaped her entire adult life. Dean's death closed the public narrative, but the private aftermath fell heavily on Jean. With Dean gone, the responsibility of memory shifted fully onto her shoulders. She became the keeper of truths the world never saw, carrying both the joy of what once was and the sorrow of how it ended, long after the applause had faded into silence. Jean Martin's final chapter, living with the weight of memory. After Dean Martin's death, Jean entered a long, quiet season of life that few outside her family ever noticed. She did not step forward to reshape his legacy or correct public myths. Instead, she withdrew, choosing privacy over recognition. Fame had once defined her world, but now it felt like a language she no longer needed to speak. What remained was memory, and memory carried a heavy cost. Jean had outlived the man who changed her life, but loss did not stop there. In the years that followed, grief returned again, this time without warning or mercy. Her daughter Claudia died after a long battle with breast cancer, another wound layered onto a life already shaped by endurance. Jean rarely spoke publicly about it, but those close to her described a woman who carried sorrow with quiet dignity, never allowing it to harden her into bitterness. As age advanced, Jean faced illness of her own. Cancer became the final challenge of her life, fought privately inside her Beverly Hills home. There were no interviews, no public appeals for sympathy. She remained surrounded by family, the same role she had played for decades. Even in decline, she was still the center holding others together. When Jean Martin died at 89, her passing was gentle, almost silent, a sharp contrast to the glamorous life she once lived. Funeral services were private, honoring her wishes. She left behind children, grandchildren, and a story often overshadowed by the man she married, yet inseparable from his fate. Jeanne was never just the wife of a star. She was a witness to the cost of fame, the fragility of family, and the long consequences of emotional distance. Her life did not end in scandal or spectacle, but in quiet survival. In many ways, that silence was the truest reflection of her strength, and the most tragic proof of how much she endured without ever asking to be seen. Dean Martin and Jean Martin shared love, loss, and a lifetime shaped by fame and grief. Do you think their story would have ended differently if fame had not stood between them? If this story moved you, leave a comment and share your thoughts.